So welcome back, everybody. We're now looking at the issue of text and how it's been generated by AI. And this is really more the problem on my side of things as an author. So, Pete, have you ever used one of these, like the chatbot GPT, and there are other ones like that are out there?
No,
Have you ever had
I've
anybody come up to you with a, well, I mean, for example, first time I came across it was this new year. So the new year,
hmm,
2023. A family, member of the family had written us all a poem using this. So they put in, write a poem for, Julia, and it
hmm.
put in, she's an author and she does this and that. And then it produced this terrible doggerel. And he did it for each member of the family, and we all roared with laughter. I
Yeah,
mean, it was so funny, but it was also really, really bad.
but also it's amusing, isn't it? I've seen people on Twitter do it, and it's initially hilarious, but there's just an emptiness to it,
Yeah.
isn't there?
So
It's not like someone's come up with something like a really witty, bad satire of a poem. It really is just a bad poem. There
yeah.
isn't that human element to it.
So next year,
Yeah.
Chris, if you're listening, you can't do that again because we won't sit there and listen to them because we thought it was funny then. I did so my son got a we were talking about this on the family chat, and my son got an internship. So I had put into the chatbot thing, write a haiku
Oh yeah, yeah.
congratulating him for getting this internship. So that was such a stupid thing to sort of write a haiku about, and it did a really good haiku. So the it's the joke lasts for, as you say, for a certain length of time. Just look, this isn't this fun? I could have sat there and thought of one myself, but I don't actually want to sit writing haikus about summer internships.
Yeah.
Anyway, so there's that side, it's the fun and game side, but I think we've also realized that it's now much better than that in terms of the reports are that it can produce academic essays that are very
Mhm.
hard to detect as being written by not by the student. Um, it can write journalism. It can write uh, content for websites. In fact, I know someone who said to me that they use it to generate the content for their websites. I mean, they would otherwise be doing it. They don't pay somebody else to do that role, but
Yeah,
they don't feel their writing skills are that strong. So they get they say, I want to say this, and then
yeah,
it gets
yeah.
turned out as a sort of, that webbies that people have. Um, and then more recently, there's been, if you imagine the tide coming into where I stand as an author,
Yeah.
nibbling at my toes is this idea that people could write books and stories. And the two articles that caught my eye about this was the announcement by one of the big sci-fi publishers, I think it was Orbit, said that they're closed to open submissions because they were getting so many AI generated submissions.
Oh,
And then just last week, there was a very funny article, funny but terrifying article on the BBC about romance writers and whether or not they're going to be taken over by book writing chatbots. And they were basing it on Bridgerton as their illustrating
yeah, yeah,
image for this.
yeah. I saw that. Yeah.
So I was then got worried. So I thought, okay, let's go and find out. So I went over to chatbot GPT and I put in, I thought, okay, write me a short story in the style of Jane Austen. Okay.
Mm.
What I got back was terrible. It was basically a really short summary of Pride and Prejudice. It didn't even bother to sort of change the names. It was just Elizabeth was going for a walk. She meets.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it was just totally rubbish, utterly uninspiring. And I thought, okay, deep breath, deep breath. Write a short story in the style of Julia Golding. Now that is quite tricky because I've got lots of different things I've done, but I thought, well,
Yeah,
let's see what it
yeah,
comes back with. What it came back was so generic and so thin that it was no more me than it was anybody else Mally Brackman or anybody else writing at the
Yeah,
moment
yeah.
in my sort of English speaking culture.
Mm.
So maybe I wasn't giving it enough detail in the commands, but I don't think it is actually yet at the stage where it can write a book. But we did launch a prize for new writing last week
Yeah.
with the Pushkin Press, and as part of our rules, we did
Okay.
say you are, no AI generated or any, basically you've got to write the book yourself.
Yeah, yeah.
You can't generate the plot or whatever by AI. You're allowed to spell check and things like that, but you're not allowed to get some other, that's doesn't qualify. We want you to actually write the book. So I'm sure that competitions and publishers will have to have this in mind. But let's look at this. So I've been
Yeah.
using AI generated images for sort of web presence, that kind of, ephemera. For you, say you wanted to write a biography of yourself for your website, and you know that a chatbot GPT can do it for you, would you be tempted to go across and cut and paste from putting in a simple command, leave it to run for 30 seconds?
Well, there's two elements is that I'd like to write it myself, but also my partner's a kind of copywriter, so she probably whatever I write I pass over to her anyway, and it's for me personally it wouldn't be necessary, but I guess if you've got a business, if you just got like you want to like we've got friends who are several kinds of small businesses. If you just want to, if you're busy, you just want to press something, go away for lunch, come back and have something you can just put on your website. It kind of makes sense to do it, doesn't it? You don't want to kind of have to hunt down a copywriter and pay them for an afternoon's work when you could just press a button and get something that is going to pass muster because the website isn't your main focus. You just want to advertise your business. So a chatbot's kind of description of you is. I also think perhaps people are so used to templates and things on the internet now and formula that they're not really going to have an issue with seeing a chatbot's kind of bio of somebody. It's just what things are like now. I
So
think it's creative people will go, oh no, we want to have our own voice. But
yeah,
lots of people just want to, if you've got to go out and work all afternoon, you just want to push a button and get in your van or whatever. It's
I think there are places where, let's talk about the positives, where, so for example, we've all done the thing where we've read instructions for something that's come from abroad, and the translation has been a really terrible Google Translate equivalent where it makes no sense at all. I can imagine there is an improvement in communication that this allows for people who are saying, write me a set of instructions or a recipe.
Yeah,
These are the things that need to be in it, or even having it in the original language and saying, translate this and put it in good English. I mean, I can imagine that is going to do a better job.
yeah,
So those sorts of communication aspects, and also it helps people who do find it difficult to write and perhaps have dyslexia or something, where they know
yeah,
what they want to say, but for me it's super easy to write 500 words, but for them that might be like running a marathon. So they would say,
yeah.
it's
There's
all right for
plenty of
you, but
yeah.
for me it's really helpful. I can make a good impression, or I can write a good speech for my my presentation or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, my partner gets, people ask her to do their personal statements and things because, when they're 18, 19 or whatever looking for work, and she can create something that works well in the environment that they're going into. She can tailor it. It's not a formulaic piece. It's taking account of them because they're friends and she knows them. and she can really do a piece of work that they can go out and say this is me. Whereas I mean, a chatbot's not going to be able to do these kind of really just subtle. I mean, as a writer, you know that this language is drawing on very subtle concepts really all the time, isn't it?
Yeah.
And little references and emphases and things like that. Whereas I think I can imagine chatbots. I'm not sure. I'll have to give it a go. I'll have to kind of come up with a. I'm
Yeah,
working
I
on
know.
a website. I'll have to
I
see
would
what they
I
have
would
to
encourage
say.
people to go and actually try these things out
Yeah,
to see what is going on, because I think there's, so let's look at the issue of, I think it's wrong in the same way as ripping off somebody's style who's got copyright is wrong. I think what's wrong in generating text is when you are pretending to have knowledge that you don't have. So if you say, write me a GCSE essay on Frankenstein, referring
yeah,
to these sources, that information hasn't gone into your brain, and it's also not being filtered through. Part of learning is actually adopting an idea for yourself,
yeah,
not
yeah,
getting, otherwise it's basically cheating. It's getting somebody else to write it for you. The fact that it's an AI writing it for you is, that really is less important than the fact that you haven't thought. You've done none of the thinking, because
no,
education is about the thinking. So that's clearly wrong, and they need to have a way of stopping students thinking it's a shortcut when really what they're doing is they're not making the journey at all. It's not a shortcut if you're not on the journey. So
no, not
that
at all.
seems quite clear. The issue of, is this going to be, would it be something which can write a novel? I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding here. So I can understand how Orbit got fed up with seeing all these submissions, but I doubt any of those submissions were actually of any quality. Um, it's just they got a load of dross coming through. So, for example, to say that you think romance novels are formulaic is to misunderstand romance novels. So, Julia
Yeah,
Quinn, the writer of Bridgerton, her novels are actually social comedies.
yeah,
And
yeah,
okay, there is a structure and a formula in the sense of, it is usually boy meets girl, though not always in romance, obviously. Boy meets girl, series of incidents, and then usually some sort of a happy ending. But that is the sort of, like, just in horror, you have a formula. In the Western, you've got a sort of expectation. But there are so many different ways of interpreting that it's the characters she creates in each of the books which tells a different story. So, and in the romance genre, it goes all the way from historical to contemporary to thriller. It's not as if it's as easy to mimic as people think, because unless you care
yeah,
about characters and interrelations, it is a genre which particularly matters that you understand how feelings work.
yeah. It's the most deep-rooted human story that
Mm.
there is, isn't it? It's
And also
yeah,
you will get loads of cliches. So I would quite like I'd quite like to be able to use chatbot GPT to say, please eliminate any cliches in this passage. So the square jawed, or the flashing eyes, or whatever it is. I can imagine finding a use as a writer for just checking I haven't fallen into white as a sheet and all those other cliches that you tend to reach for
yeah,
when you're feeling lazy.
yeah,
So to be a bit like an editor on my shoulder saying, hang on, that's lazy writing. I can see a use for that, but not, we don't need endless screeds of he looked like a fallen angel style descriptions of heroes, which is, used a bit too much. But I don't think, because there's no person or understanding of feelings behind it, I don't think it'd be interesting. And it wouldn't push.
no,
I mean, maybe able to write, maybe there'll be a phase when when there's more emergent consciousness of artificial intelligence, that they'll be interesting about what it's like to fall in love as an artificial intelligence. In the same way, you know, Data in Star Trek was an interesting character. But I don't
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
It seems as though the it's in the end a bit like a clever parrot.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Eh, I mean, having read around it, the fact that it's only taking in what people, it's taking in what people are putting into it, but it's not understanding where that stuff is coming from, is it? It's not. I, I used to get an illustrators magazine, and it was quite highbrow, and obviously the people have been on illustration courses and than the academic side of thinking about illustration, whereas I hadn't. So they do kind of small interviews with illustrators, and one of the questions they asked, and it was obviously kind of a term that had come out of illustration teaching. It it asked what, and initially I thought, oh, what, what's this ridiculous term they're asking? But it asked something like, what are the frictions that you deal with? What are the things that you just what are the problems, I guess, in a way? What are the things that stop things running smoothly in your process? And it's that idea of friction seems to be, it really is about, it's a very human thing. It's just the idea in your head about how your life will be and the everyday frictions that stop it happening. So the AI is not going to be able to understand the, the frictions, but it's the frictions that make the stories that are about. So I mean, in romance, friction is there, isn't it? The
Well,
characters
that's what you need. Yeah.
don't get together. They, you know, my work came out of lots of frictions. Just being a human being in the world, seeing things in a certain way, finding a way to express that. As creative people, we're kind of all the time kind of dealing with these frictions, and I just cannot see how AI would ever be able to work that into whatever it's doing. I don't even if you try to write it into programs or whatever, it wouldn't understand the idea of being a consciousness that exists and is kind of just trying to get through day-to-day life, which is what informs the art that we try and communicate with. So
Mm.
it just seems like there's a vacuum in it, which if even though I say perhaps romance sci-fi things, they seem to be formulaic from the outside, but as you say, they're not. They're dealing with human existence and human consciousness and human relations, which there's always friction. And if you can't put friction into those stories, then you haven't really got a story, I don't think, have you?
So there is a way where I can see it be useful. So
Yeah,
imagine a scenario where you're Barbara Broccoli. I know that's, alter ego. Um, and you're saying, okay, what's our plot for our next James Bond going to be? Before they've got writers involved. So they might sit in a room and say, okay, let's spin the wheel. They could do this by, yanking a book off the shelf or some kind of lottery where they say, right, but they could put into the online AI think up a James Bond plot set in the context of the current war in Ukraine
yeah,
or outer space or South America. And back would come some skeletal plot. And they could say, I don't think we'd do that. Maybe that idea, though, is the kind of direction we want to go in. So we want to actually have a freedom fighter from that's a good idea. And then really important that's a good idea. Why don't we see who writes really well in this area? Oh, who wrote Narcos? Let's
yeah,
find one of the
yeah,
writers from Narcos. We know they do good. So let's see if they want to come on to. So I can imagine using it as a kind of prompt to say, in our
yeah,
airless
definitely.
room where we're planning our next big movie, perhaps we could get some inspiration, ideas that are the equivalent of putting it up on the whiteboard, brainstorming. So I could see it like that, but I would I would think that if they go on and say write us the script, what you
Yeah,
would then get is something that should be quite disjointed and airless. And um, James Bond actually is one of those characters which doesn't have much character, oddly. So he might do better than many other characters, but it would still feel like a puppet moving through a
yeah.
series
It's
of
all
events.
he's almost yeah but he works as like a almost like a blank that with it's odd. He's kind of a blank character, but with lots of charisma that people put onto him.
Yeah,
But
he is an
they kind of
interesting. He could be
yeah,
generated by AI, can't
I
he?
kind of feel they put their concept of their own charisma onto him, and that's why I love it so much.
Yeah, and that's
But
why
so
each
he has,
actor is able to inhabit that role. Yeah.
yeah,
So I think that in the same ways as a writer, I don't think, I can't break the loom. I can't break the AI is there. Um, and I can see how it might, in the same way as the images inspired ideas, I could see it doing the same for people looking for ideas. I think that, like you were saying, there's a lack of feeling and warmth and content underneath it that means that it's barren in the end. So any place where you want something to be looked at and understood as a cultural the music rather than music, we
yeah,
should
yeah,
not be reliant on these tools. We should, if they're there at all, they should be at some sort of support to the creative level, not being
yeah,
the
yeah.
creative.
That they're going to be useful to take up a certain cultural space where there
Yeah.
isn't the inclination or budget to commission original visions. I think, but
Mm.
as you're saying, it will be a really interesting thing for writers and artists and creative people to kind of to try and get their heads around because it's already being presented with an air, a sinister air, like it's a great thing that's going to cause nuclear war and things. It already feels like it's people are using that Terminator idea in a way, aren't they? Terminator 2, that the machines gain consciousness and then attack us. And it feels
Well,
like people are already relating AI to that. And I wonder, people, it feels like it's going to be a really fruitful thing but only if people come to a human with their human reactions. This great sinister presence in our lives as it's being presented.
so in terms of um, what we're trying to do at the Oxford Centre for Fantasy is I've got a sort of outline of a policy which I'll run by you to see if you think it seems fair. So um, we will continue to employ illustrators and designers because the other part of this are designers who may be using photographs and other assets to design things. We'll continue to pay and employ them, but we will also make use of AI assets where it's sort of things which we wouldn't be paying someone to do otherwise. There wasn't a budget for that.
Yeah,
It's just the stuff that makes things pretty. In the same way as we use the Canva or whatever to design things, we'd use it like that. But we'd continue to showcase and celebrate illustrators, particularly for being humans of different visions. Same goes with the sort of text base. I personally won't be using chatbot GPT to write content, but
yeah,
if
yeah.
somebody wants to generate a social media post, I'm not going to worry about that
No,
because it's social media.
yeah,
But if I'm judging in the competition that we're running for the new fantasy writer or anything where it matters that it's somebody's artistic vision, then we don't want the AI generator involved because you're actually sharing the creativity there with the people who program this thing, plus the myriad of stuff it's hoovered up on the
yeah,
internet. So try and have a sort of sense of let's continue to celebrate artists and employ artists. Let's celebrate writers and reward writers, but also be aware that we can't do a King Canute because the tide is coming in. There's got to be a place in the ecosystem where these things are being used. Does that sound kind of fair as a policy.
Yeah, yeah, that absolutely, yeah. It isn't going to go away, but it's something I think it's something people will have, like going back to that friction idea, people will have, they're going to have really interesting responses to it. It's as human beings, we're going to tell each other stories about this new element in our environment. So, and as human beings, we're going to use the bits that we want and forget about and
Yeah, going to
keep away
pirate a
from the other
few
bits.
or record a few mixtapes, which I seem to remember was a thing when back in the day in the 80s.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it was all we all yeah. So as
Yes.
a bit of fun at the end, Pete, we've been talking a lot about creating imagery. I always ask my guest, where in all the worlds is the best place for something? And that means all the fantasy worlds. If you had to go and be a fantasy illustrator, perhaps a children's book illustrator or something like that, in any of the fantasy worlds that you've come across, where would you like to go?
I'm not sure if the Doctor Zeus world counts as a fantasy world.
Oh, yeah, why
Uh,
not? I mean, you can
um,
imagine transform yourself into a cartoon in
I
that
don't, yeah,
world. That'd
I
be
don't think
fun.
I wouldn't get much illustrating done. It would be just too bizarre watching
You
things
could
go
be in a
by.
little corner
No,
drawing everybody. Oh, that's nice. That made me
yeah,
think of the Richard Scarry world.
yeah.
How busy they are. You could be a little person drawing in a corner. I was thinking of one place that'd be quite interesting to be in would be Inkheart, the Cornelia Funke books, because there you've got this thing where if you read something out loud, it comes to life. But I'm wondering about an aspect of being able to draw something and it coming to life. That would be fun. And where you could
Yeah,
actually have a fantasy world where something comes off the page. I think I'd like to go there.
yeah.
Um,
That would be that sounds like a fable in the making, doesn't
Yeah, no, I've just
it?
copyright that idea quickly.
Yeah,
Oh no, but AI's heard it, so they're going to hoover it up, and it'll be in
yeah,
someone's story
yeah.
next. Um,
I
so
wonder if being in the AI world as a human being, I wonder what that would be like, seeing all this,
yes,
just trying to make sense of it actually within it. I'm not sure. Yeah.
so and also just to celebrate craftsmanship, is there one illustrator that you think we should go and wait and have a look at? You mentioned several whilst you were talking, but um, who would you say this is a really inspiring illustrator?
Um, a contemporary illustrator that I really like is Steve May. He's just got books out with. He's got a book out with about Vikings at the moment. He's just got this really dynamic style. I think he seems to have come out of those early '80s comics that were just daft. They're weekly comics that were just full of silliness. The Viz eventually started taking the mick out of. I really like it. I look to his work to kind of keep a dynamism in my own work. I really like him.
And so I would say for in this sort of idea of what sort of text writer would I recommend is I don't know I mentioned this before, but there was a book by Michael End called the or Ender called The Never Ending Story, which then did become a film. But if you look at
Mm.
the actual book and find one of the early editions, what he does there is he draws your attention to the actual writing by having green and red typeface for the different worlds you're in and
Oh, okay.
illustrated illuminated letters and vignettes. So the actual book I remember adoring, the actual physical book. It's a great story too. So
Yeah,
I would
yeah,
recommend going and having a look in that and just enjoying really original vision through text and how it draws you into the story. So that's my tip. So thanks, Pete. Thanks very
okay.
much
Thank you.
for helping me think this through. And I think this
Yeah,
is, the tidal wave is sweeping over us both. Let's see if we can emerge on the other side.
I wonder if we'll be having a podcast in 5 years where we're all in burnt
Yeah,
out
all these AI
craters.
taken
You
over.
know? Yeah,
Yeah,
I'd imagine it'll be much the same as it is now. There's
thank you.
human inspiration everywhere.